get started. Thank you for attending the fourth session of the Wimmera Biodiversity Seminar. 5 weeks of September gave us an extra one this week, so thanks very much. We hope that everyone's travelling along okay in these interesting and challenging times that we're all living in. And obviously last year we moved to an online format for the Biodiversity Seminar for the first time, and this year we have run with that again, thankfully. As it's worked out well, we've got a lot of attendees and some great speakers over the past 3 weeks, and today and next week will be our last one. This year we're focusing on the most important factors in our preservation and restoration of biodiversity across the region. Our farmers, as principal custodians of much of the land across the region, farmers and the work that they do to maintain the land and environment play an increasingly important role in biodiversity conservation. And we hope you enjoy what we've got on offer today. And if you want to join us next week, please sign up for that session as well. I'd like to begin with the Acknowledgement of Country. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of all the land, wherever we are joining this seminar from today. For me, participating in Horsham, this is the land of the Watchabolic, Jadwa, Jadwajali, Wagaya and Yalpagalp peoples, and I'd like to extend and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and any other elders who may be joining us today. We recognise Indigenous proud traditions, vibrant culture and continued connection to land, water and the community. I'd also like to acknowledge the support that we have from our hard-working committee, and this committee does a lot of work behind the scenes to get everything running and make sure our speakers are all ready to go. And this year's event's been supported by Bank Australia, Baringa Gadgin Land Council, Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, Trust for Nature, GWM Water and the Wimmera CMA. As a participant, some housekeeping for today. We've set the system up so that you can not present, not have your video and microphone going if you're an attendee. You might be able to sneak in and get your face on the camera, but we'll soon change those settings. This is to keep the airwaves free for our presenters during their presentations. If you've got any questions for our presenters throughout the day, you can add them in the chat function on the side of the screen, and during the presentations we'll look at those questions, and if you like any of the questions that other people have posed, give it a thumbs up and we'll ensure that those questions get addressed at the end of the presentation. You can also view the presentation today on YouTube, and Matt's put a link to that in the chat if you're more comfortable viewing through YouTube. And if you've got any questions, if you're viewing through YouTube, you can put them to the Wimmera Biodiversity Seminar at Hotmail email account, and we'll be monitoring that during the presentation as well. This presentation is being recorded, so you don't need to record the presentation. If you'd like to view it at a later date, it'll be available on the Swift website, where all of last year's presentations and this year's presentations are being kept for public viewing. If you've got any IT issues or any problems throughout the session, please feel free to email us at that Hotmail account, which is Wimmera Biodiversity Seminar at hotmail.com, or you can put any issues in the chat function. One of the exciting things that we do every year with the Biodiversity Seminar is have mugs for our attendees, and when that's in person it's very easy and we have a rough idea of what numbers we get, and last year we ordered 75 mugs and they all went very quickly, so this year we've upped it to the first 175 registrations will receive a mug. We're not promising that it'll be posted out in the immediate future after the seminars have wrapped up, but we're hoping to get them to you by the end of the year. It'll just depend on postage and things like that. And at the end of the session, we'll have an online survey. If you could click on that link to the survey and fill out some very quick questions about any ideas for future forums and how we went today. That'd be really great too. Thank you. I forgot to introduce myself at the very start. I'm Melissa Douglas. I work for the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning as a Community and Partnership Program Officer and a member of the Biodiversity Seminar Committee. All right. I'd like to introduce Laverne Lehman. Laverne's a long-standing Wimmera Biodiversity Seminar Committee member, and Laverne's going to introduce our first speaker for today. Thanks, Laverne.
Thanks, Mel. And firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which we are on. Obviously, everyone is on a different in a different part of the world. Given that we could actually be almost anywhere these days as we're online, but for me it's the same as Mel. I'm in Dimboola on Watchabolic country. Until recently, I was working with Berengee Land Council, and one of the real pleasures for me in having not only working for them but also being on the board for a number of years prior to that was seeing how the organisation was starting to develop and make some changes and really start to stamp its credentials in terms of what they wanted to achieve for traditional owners in this part of the world. Our first speaker today is Tim Mccartney, who's the acting CEO for Berengee, and some of the work that Tim has been doing in the last couple of years since he joined the organisation has really moved that effort along quite significantly, and some of the work he's also done in terms of the native food sector for traditional owners in Victoria has been really important as well. So Tim's, it's my great pleasure to introduce Tim to this morning to talk about what is happening and with Berengee and those aspirations, and how that can impact and change on how we view biodiversity and farming, in particularly in the Wimmera. So to that end, I will hand over to Tim, and he will start presenting. Thank you.
Thanks, Laverne. Thanks for the kind introduction. Laverne sells herself a little bit short that the work that I was able to achieve over the last couple of years was only enhanced by having Laverne as at my right hand a lot of that way too. So thanks to Laverne. I too would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that I am on at the moment. I started on Watchabolic country early this morning. So I want to pay respect to my ancestors, past, present, and the emerging leaders in our community as well, but I also want to pay respects to the land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, where I find myself this morning giving this presentation. So generally, I'm pretty good at talking about stuff. I find these things really challenging sometimes, so bear with me a little bit because I can sort of ramble a little bit as well. But I've got a quick presentation just to tell you a little story about, for those who don't know what BGLC is and the work that we're doing around our native nursery and also around our prioritisation of our native foods business as well. So give me one sec, I'll just get this up and running. It was working all fine before. There we go. Okay, so I'll go a little bit into, so this presentation is around our Dalki Garinga native nursery and our Wutu Garinga Bunyam people growing food initiative that we're running, that we're starting a journey on at the moment at Berengee. So for those who don't know who Berengee is, we represent the traditional owners of the Watchabolic, the Jardwa, Jali, Wagai and Yabakal people. We were the first group in Southeast Australia to be recognised as native title holders over country, and that was nearly 16 years ago. And we're also the federally recognised authority to speak on behalf of Watchabolic people, and we're the only body in the region with legislative authority to make decisions around cultural heritage. A lot of people will say, where is Watchabolic country? And so this is a bit of a map of our boundaries. As you see, it comes all the way down to Ararat, out to Eden Hope, up to Oyen, Sea Lake. It's quite a very broad country that we've got. And what started a few years ago was where's the opportunity for us to have to go for our aspirations, our goals, and look for our economic independence as an organisation, but also to provide opportunities for our traditional owners. And what we really quickly understood was the region where our country that's fortunate to call home, that my ancestors were fortunate to call home for a long period of time, is now a large agriculture industry. And how do we engage in that industry, and how do we start to care for our country in a modern contemporary way? And so we went down the path of our country plan and also looking at our economic development strategy as well. So in 2019, we started an economic development strategy looking at our short, medium and long-term goals. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to have a strong and healthy Watchabolic culture. We want to have a healthy country, and that means that it's everything from our from the soil to our plants to our animals to our waterways. Country is a part of us. It's a part of who we are. It's our identity. And I can appreciate that from a lot of people that'll be on this stream today, that there are a lot of people that have a connection to the region as well, through multiple generations as well. And that's a shared thing, and we want to see our country thrive. We want to see an engaged and connected Watchabolic community. Unfortunately, due to things that occurred some time ago in the mission era, that our community was separated. And and I'm one of those people that as a Watchabolic man, that my family was moved away from the area, and it's only as I return to country now and continue that connection. And we want to continue to provide those opportunities for our community to come back and connect with country. So we're really about how we get recognition and respect as well. So recognition as the traditional custodians of the land, in which was called Watchabolic country now, but also the respect about what we do and how we do it as well. We want to be economically sustainable, and we want to have healthy Watchabolic people. And also our corporation, strong corporation with excellent governance. And we're a voice for Watchabolic people. So, healthy Watchabolic peoples is really key for people that are familiar with Aboriginal affairs and the Closing the Gap. We still don't live as long as non-Aboriginal people in this country, and we do have underlying health issues. And our native foods are a source for us to be able to start to address some of those issues. And that's really about the prioritisation of what have we used to have in our diets, and how can we actually look at introducing them again back in a modern contemporary way. So out of the economic development strategy, it started to have a look at how everything would tie in together. And over the last sort of couple of months, we came together with the Wutunga Garinga Banyam initiative, which is in Wagaya language. Our language is called People Growing Food. And obviously our nursery is at the centre of all that. We've invested a lot of time and resources into getting the nursery that's located at the Wales State Forest. And for those who are familiar with the region would, known it in a lot of different iterations, and a lot of people in the region have a connection to that nursery. And it's a real key part to us about how we continue to care for country and growing our native plants that are there, having a seed bank that's sourced from local seeds there, that we can grow our plants in a really organic way to rehabilitate country. And we've been successful with some contracts in doing some revegetation works, and that's the first part of it. And now the next part is about how do we continue to commercialise that, but how do we actually start to look at how do we build our bush food brand. And our bush food brand called Dalki Bunyam, which is called Good Food, is the next progression to that, around native species, turning them into food product, and then looking at how we actually acquire the land to be able to do that. And we know as we link it all together, there's tourism opportunities here. So, it's a really exciting opportunity for us to invest in this going forward, because it can provide a real mutually beneficial industry in country. is just a slide about our nursery. So Dalki Gurringa, which is good growing in Wagai language, and that is owned and operated by the Land Council, and it has been for coming up to 4 years, but there has been a significant transition over the last 2 years with big investment into infrastructure upgrades out there, new irrigation system, repairing some damaged buildings to get it to where it can function to its full capacity. That site's a 14-hectare site, and we're really about pushing that going forward. We're the largest native nursery owned by a traditional owner corporation in this state, and we continually to do that, and we want to keep pushing that. So why do we get into the foods? Why do we want to get into native foods? Why are we doing it? Purely because there's part of it that's, for us, about our connection to our stories, our people and our plants, but also too, there's becoming a demand in it in the industry. So we talk about what the state of the industry is, and so the native food industry is growing at a rapid rate. It's been valued a couple of years ago at around about $50 million, and they expect that to grow over the next at least 5 times over the next decade. That's conservative figures on that growth, given the demand that exists in there. However, less than 2% of the industry is actually controlled or owned by First Nations people, traditional owners across the land. There's been an exploitation of cultural intellectual property that people have gathered and then commercialised it because, as traditional owners or Aboriginal people, we don't have the intergenerational wealth and we don't have the access to land to be able to commercialise some of these things. And so we talk about what are the 4 key pillars to it. Is now the conversation is happening at a national level to create national standards, and there's a national body, the First Nations Bush Food and Botanicals Alliance. I'm lucky enough to be the Victorian director on that organisation. That is an organisation controlled by First Nations people from across the country that's starting to have those conversations at a national level about how do we have these controls or mechanisms in the industry to control the outcomes, and that's around provenance and authenticity. If you think about some of the major wines that are around, and that it's all about traceability and provenance, knowing where your provenance is, and the authenticity and the demand from the market is coming through. People want to buy from an Aboriginal business. They want to have an authentic experience and know that money is being reinvested back into the community. There are still the needs for some changes to our law system, and there's the education and awareness piece as well. And these are 4 real key pillars that the national body is looking at, but it's actually and being replicated into Victoria as well. There are challenges in the native food industry because there's not enough consistent supply to meet the demand for commercial purposes. Currently, there's still a lot of wild harvest that's going on in the industry in Victoria and in our country. That's very hard because there's not a lot of wild land that you can do it and make it commercially viable. So we're looking at how do we adapt that into a modern contemporary crop farming option or broadacre farming. How does that look like from our native food species that are endemic to this region, and how do we grow that in a way that becomes commercially viable? The protection of Indigenous intellectual property, cultural intellectual property, is a really key thing for us. Our knowledge and then the uses of those plants, whether it be for food sources or medicinal sources, those stories are handed down by our elders through generations. And there are a couple of examples of plants that have been commercialised for for medical uses and beauty products globally, and that's been at the exclusion of the traditional owners on that. So we want to have a look about how do we go and make this viable. And so our initiative is about that we want to start to control the outcome. So we want to develop the model, and we have a look at where we are now, and we're probably in that 21 to 22, we're coming into that now, but we've got enough plants at the nursery that we can start to look at how do we form the process about growing them in a commercial environment. How do we do that? And our first part is about land acquisition that we'll hold to be able to pilot some of these things. But we know that not all soils are equal across the vast size of our country, and so we need to look at how that is. But we know that we can't do this alone to be able to meet the demand from industry. And so one of our things is we really are key to, we want to care for country. And that means that we need to work with private landowners to be able to provide solutions or an opportunity for private landholders to participate in this process, and that's about creating local wealth back into the local economy as well. So, we want to once we get the model right and be able to come up and show private landholders this is what we can provide for you. If you grow these plants and harvest these, we can do the manufacturing on site. We can up on country. We can provide rewarding opportunities there, and then we can distribute it both domestically or internationally. There's a lot of work to be done around how we want to go through, and reaching the government's commitment around carbon neutral. Looking at how we know that herbicides and pesticides, chemical uses in agriculture, attributes to 17% of the emissions from the industry, and we go, well, if we can start to reduce that, can we develop this in a model that actually is really minimalistic in its approach and its effect on the wider environment? How does it look at with the water usage instead of having irrigated lots of land? What is the water usage and growth and returns and yields that we can have on that as well? So the opportunities are quite endless in that sense, and the opportunity for us to be able to target our region, our country, to be the leaders in that. There are a lot of cultural alignments with us taking this, to taking this approach. And that is, we will provide opportunities for our community to spend more time on Watchabolic country. We will be able to educate and pass on that knowledge to our next generation, and there'll be rewarding jobs for our community. We start to create the intergenerational wealth that we don't have. We will strengthen our culture and our language, and you'll see from the branding and the words that we use in this, Dalki Garinga, Watu Bunyam, and Dalki Bunyam is all about reintroducing our Wagai language into what we do. Language is really important, in who we are as a part of our identity. We want to have stronger partnerships, whether that be with industry bodies, with state agencies, or private landholders, or the wider community. And we ultimately want to care for our country. This is a bit of a mind map that's been put together around how we see that it all working. And so, with Dalki Garinga there, and moving into, our Watu Garinga Bunyam, partnerships with private landowners, our sustainable farming, being carbon neutral, our Dalki Bunyam native foods, about value-add food production. I was in a meeting some months ago where they talked about 99% of the raw product that's produced on our country is sent out of the region for value adding, and we want to actually start to do the value adding up there. We want to be the leader of industry across the nation about how we do this and working with the broader community. We want to heal our country. We want to make sure the right plants are in the right country. So some of our plants have been able to withstand thousands of generation extreme climate events, whether it be flood, fire, or changing in complete climates, and our plants have been able to withstand that. And so we want to start to make sure that we are putting the right plants back into the right country. We want to use our language, and we want to provide employment. The employment opportunities that we see going forward, there's going to be employment opportunities for our community, but there's employment opportunities for the wider community too, that this is not about just for traditional owners. There's going to be an opportunity for people to stay in the township or where they've got connection, where they've grown up for some time, with rewarding opportunities, and not have to move off to find opportunities to work in industries that are interesting to them. So what we've been able to get some investment to be able to resource for our first harvest. But we looking at food safe facility for handling our raw ingredients. We're down the pathway of identifying our dehydrators and grinders. We're able to start doing some little samples in that over the last 6 months about at the nursery about drying techniques and mixing products and that, plant packaging equipment, and looking at attracting skilled food product development employees and collaborators and partners. We are fortunate at the moment. We do have a partnership with Mount Zero around the Pink Lake salt harvest, and we want to really lean on that partnership as well. That they are in the region. Their oils are grown on Watchabolic country. We want to be able to work with our partner there and brand out a little bit more. There's still a little bit of work that we need to do around our market research on the native food products, and we need to look at what are the non-food products we can do, whether that's in beauty products or personal care products. Develop potential collaborations for raw ingredients to be used in some more and complex. So we want to create the supply chain that we can link in with other providers, other businesses to be able to add our ingredients into. We want to be able to create a supply chain where we know where other Indigenous businesses are, or traditional owners that are sourcing their native foods, to be able to support them and create a circular economy within traditional owners. Our culture is based off a system of trade, and we want to reintroduce that in a modern contemporary way. There's a lot of work to be done in product development and testing that with the market, relationship development and retail customers. Our native Delki Goringa, there's a lot of work happening at the nursery, and we expect that by the end of the year, COVID pending restrictions, that'll be open to retail, and we want to be able to house our products at the nursery. People can come and see a plant, buy the plant, but then have a look at what an ingredient might look like, and how they can take that all home in the one time, and drive a market into a visitor market that'll come, but also some of the education will walk away with a little bit more knowledge, and community education on using native foods and specifically using our foods. This sort of just talks about, again, that there is the demand. So domestic demand, a tourism, a unique experience demand, but also export. The demand from over in the UK and over in the Asian markets for native foods is going gangbusters at the moment. If you look around the world around, food sovereignty and sustainable farming and regenerative farming, and how we can provide food sources for the growing population globally, the countries that have a high population are really starting to look at where alternative sources to be able to get their food products in. And it's changing, so where we were 3-4 years ago to now, earlier this year, COVID years seem like it's 10 years for everyone. I was fortunate enough to work on this strategy and launch this strategy down at on Gunai Kunai country. It's the first of its type in Australia of a traditional owner native food and botanical strategy that's done by the Federation of Traditional Owners and with Agriculture Victoria. And this strategy starts to put on the agenda for state government to invest in this, to invest in traditional owners, to start to really own the industry, whilst looking at culture, country, community, and making it commercially viable, making sure that the system and frameworks there to support traditional owners leading this industry into a new sustainable regenerative farming model. I'll leave it there. I hope that wasn't it was clear enough, or people got something out of that. But yeah, so thanks for the time to have a chat.
Thanks very much, Tim. That was really great and really informative about what Baringa Gadgin is doing in the bush food space. There isn't any questions yet in the chat, but I've had to think about a couple of questions, and one of them is there any ideas or any early indications of some of the local species that might be first cab off the rank to be used as a bush food?
Yeah, so we've been trying, with our native thymes. We've been growing our murnongs chocolate lilies, vanilla lilies, and saltbush as a baseline. There's the obvious one that we really want to look at that takes some time and we need to develop our capability is looking at quandongs, muntries as well, and also looking at wattle seeds as well. So what that looks like, and those are some longer term things. But at the moment, we're sort of looking at how do we get into market and how do we provide something that we've got right now, and so we really want to get into there, and then we can start to build the capacity as well.
Yep. That sounds great. I really like the idea of being able to go to a local restaurant and being able to see native bush foods on the menu. I think would just, sounds so exciting. Really, really look forward to that. A question from Adam: does future commercial production or harvesting of bush foods require access to modified land, farmland, or biodiverse areas with native vegetation cover, or a bit of both?
Yeah. So I think one thing I probably didn't touch on there is where we see the opportunity that what we see is that all the country, we want to really target all the country in that, and so some of the areas that might not be as adaptable to native food straight away still needs to have that time. But so if we took the industry as a total from our country, $1 billion industry, if we were able to convert 5 to 10% of that into a native food market over the next decade, we're talking a $50 to $100 million industry just in our region alone, on our country, and that's a really good. That's a real exciting piece, and we've seen that private landowners on our country will open their minds to new techniques, and through what happened in the drought with saltbush for stock feed, and even the Wimmera CMA had been doing some work on some trial sites around native foods on some marginal agricultural land, and being able to look at that. So we think that any of it, we'd love to be able to target some really prime areas, but we also know that what we want to do needs to be designed that it can work on all the country, not just let parts of our country suffer.
That's great. That's answered quite a few questions. A few people had a few questions about accessing country and landholders' involvement and the opportunity for that, and also around the share market. Is there opportunities in the share market for Barangi Gadgin to get in on that?
I probably need more information about the share market. Are we talking about commodity and list and probably
which is probably a crystal ball gazing. Let's see how it goes in the first 20 years, and then
pretty much. But what we're really about for this model is that we want to design the model and have people that know things. So we're really looking for people to help, provide some advice. There's stuff that we just don't know because we're not commercial farmers as yet. We're traditional farmers, and we're trying to walk in those two worlds and look at a modern contemporary way. But this model only succeeds by getting involved with once the model's designed, and we can provide private landholders with some surety. And we really want to own that commercial intellectual property around what that model is, and then work with private landholders, like other industries have, about certifying growers and making sure there's a code of conduct and a set of standards that we would want to work with that private landholder to make sure that, and then we can provide access to market or, to deliver into that. And that's a really good way, I think, about going forward with it, because, again, there's a lot of people that want to go into native foods, and this is a way that we can actually work together to be able to have the greatest impact.
Yep, well, that sounds good. There's one last question. You mentioned the industry tie-in with botanical companies. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Yeah,
I suppose that right now is we're open to have conversations with a lot of people, but until there's some legislative reform around recognising our knowledge as a special knowledge, so currently cultural intellectual property, and we would have seen this, people would have seen this around cultural intellectual property in the art industry and the way that they can be duplicated and profited off by by larger companies. And native foods are not dissimilar to that. And so on a Commonwealth level, there needs to be legislative reform to protect the secret and special knowledge of our ancestors about how these plants were used. And unfortunately, large pharmaceutical companies have not done that in the past, and patent laws and copyright doesn't protect old stuff, and it doesn't, if it's not secret. Because our culture is an orally taught culture, it means that it doesn't meet the legal definition of a secret. So we've had conversations at a federal level about what that looks like, and at a state level as well. So I think that's probably, there needs to be some protections that are put in place before that can be progressed down the line any further.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's really important to think about those big corporations have money and lawyers and know how to work the system, and if they see an opportunity, they might run with that before the bush food companies have got a chance to really establish themselves. So there's an example of a kangaroo apple plant that is a women's business plant for us that was taken overseas into a company and used with the knowledge that that company retrieved from elders in Australia and commercialised that into a medical pill that's $1 billion industry, but because it's international, there's no legal protection over there. So it happens, so it's just one of those challenges. Thanks very much for your time, Tim. We've got a few other questions there, so if during the presentation, if you want to answer a few of those questions that are sitting there, that would be great if you've got the time to join with us for our next presenter. And our next presenter I'd like to introduce is Colin Cease, and Colin and his son Nicholas own the 20,000 acre property Winona, which runs 4,000 merino sheep, and they're managed through holistic planned grazing. And Colin's going to talk to us today about the development, application and benefits of multi-species pasture cropping. So I'd like to welcome Colin. I think you're on mute.
Yeah. Okay, just do that.
We're all good. We can see your presentation and hear you. Thanks, Colin.
Okay. Thank you. Before I start, I'd just like to thank Tim for his talk on native foods and everything he said. I'm also involved in grasslands and native grasses, and been involved in some work with the Gamilaroi Aboriginal people, Narrabri, in conjunction with Sydney University. A lot of very good information coming out on that, on grassland species. So I may be able to help Tim there with a bit of knowledge on grasses and grasslands. But anyway, I'll just move on with my talk. I'd just like to thank Tim for that. And I'll be talking a little bit about grasses in this talk, but not as much. I'm going to do another talk to the Ballerine Grasslands Group in about a month's time. But anyway, we'll move on. That's if I can, okay. Now, I'm going to talk about restoring a farm ecosystem, which I guess will start to make sense to you, because if we're talking about biodiversity, we also need to talk about functioning farm ecosystems as well. Just a little bit of information about myself. We haven't got 20,000 acres here, it's 2,000 acres, which is a bit of difference. I'm Central Tablelands, New South Wales, which is about 300 k's northwest of Sydney. Just a little bit about the property itself. That 2,000 acres or 840 hectares is divided into 75 paddocks now, and that's for planned grazing, which I am going to talk about. That's divided with hinge joints, fencing, and mainly watered by dams. But what I wanted to get onto is the property now is a restored native grassland. It has 14% fenced timbered remnant, and over the years I've planted about 15,000 native trees and shrubs. for shelter and ecological benefits. I've also planted about 1,500 paddock trees, single paddock trees. That's for shade of livestock, but it's mostly about restoring the whole grassland ecosystem with scattered trees through the grassland. Just a little bit on the practical side of what we're doing. We run 4,000 merino sheep here, a little bit of cattle trading, not a lot. But grow about 2,000 hectares, around 500 acres of, well, now mostly oats, but over the years, wheat and cereal rye. Have a merino stud, which we sell rams from, and we also have a Kelpie stud, which we sell dogs for all around the world. And the native grass seed is a major or very important enterprise to us. And we sell seed mostly for rehab work and to farmers for restoring their properties, eating and sowing native seed. Right, to tell my full story, I need to tell you a tiny bit about what happened to my family in this process, but I'm going to move through this. This is only a little short talk, so I'll skip through it quickly. My great-grandparents settled here, where we are, in the 1860s, and they started with merino sheep and wool and started growing wheat also in 1868. The original grassland, we have good knowledge on what the grasslands were like here, and it was very high quality, and it contained over 200 plant species. Very diverse grassland. Nothing unusual about this particular grassland. That's what all of our native grasslands were, at least that many species in them. Industrial agriculture was adopted by my father in the 1930s, and that was a major problem in that, okay, it was very profitable to him, but very rapidly destroyed the grasslands and associated soil with those crop growing methods. In the 1950s, from the 1950s, my father introduced, high input industrialised agriculture by the way of sun annual pasture and fertiliser and ploughing and cultivating, fertiliser and pesticides on the property. And that high input system was very productive during that era. When I came home from school, or also a little bit before, I continued with that work, ploughing and cultivating and basically destroying the property. It was really fortunate that I didn't have a bigger plough, otherwise I'd done far more damage than I did. But so I grew up in high input agriculture with a lot of fertiliser and pesticides. So that form of agriculture was doing serious damage to the property. And it was actually costing my father in particular, $80,000 annually on today's figures. So it was a very expensive system to maintain. So how and why did I change? So during the 1970s, the cost of farm inputs was becoming very high, and it became unprofitable, mostly because those farm inputs were high. And this is in the 1970s. Costs have become a lot higher now. But in 1979, we had a major bushfire, which was similar to those fires that we had 2 or 3 years ago. So we lost everything on the property. There was 3,000 sheep killed, all the buildings destroyed. Pretty well most of the fencing was burnt, and we went from sort of going okay to broke overnight. So that was a bit of a challenge, to say the least. How do you survive from something like that? What I did was look for low input agriculture methods. And why I was looking for low input agriculture methods is that I simply couldn't afford the methods that we used previously. So I stopped using fertiliser and pesticides, and I focused on 100% ground cover And I focused on restoring grassland on the property. And to achieve that, I adopted holistic plan grazing, and then I developed pasture cropping, or a different way of growing crops in the early 1990s. So how did I restore the Winona grassland? As I just previously said, I changed the way we grazed and grew crops. But now, and those early times when I was working a lot of this out, I started looking at combining grazing and cropping into a single land management system where each one benefits the other. We're told all the time in cropping programs that we shouldn't have animals on it, which is, and that is absolutely totally wrong. Animals are a vital part of not only our properties being profitable, but restoring our properties, our farms' ecosystems. Just a little bit on grazing management, and now, well, not specifically grazing management, but what we're doing here. But we need to be aware that the way we graze animals simply isn't working, and it hasn't worked for thousands of years. The way we graze animals has been very destructive all over the world, in that animals, if grazed poorly, kill grasslands. They destroy soil ecosystems and they destroy farm ecosystems. So nothing wrong with the animal. That isn't the problem. It's the human managing the animal that's the problem. So here now, and from the early 1990s, we've run 2 mobs of sheep, mostly 2 mobs of sheep, about 2,500 adult sheep, and the hoggets are 15. There's 1,500 generally of them. When we have cattle, they're included with the sheep, and there's 75 paddocks on the property now, and a 4-month recovery period. In other words, it's 4 months before the animals or the sheep get back to where they started. So in other words, the plants get a recovery time of 4 months before they've regrazed. That's just a photo of our main mob of ewes with lambs. There's about 2,500 ewes there with their lambs. So there's around about 5,000 sheep in that mob. That photo is just, we were just moving them through a gateway at the time. In the foreground there is just the native grassland that we have at home here now. So that form of grazing, holistic grazing management, and using a grazing rotation will definitely encourage perennial grass species. It'll encourage the increasing numbers and germination of species. It will discourage annual weeds, and it will help to restore the soil ecosystem and farm ecosystem. So if we just move on to crops, growing crops, the way crops are growing using ploughs and excessive herbicide and pesticides do pretty well the same as poor grazing management. They kill grasslands. The only problem with crops is that, or growing crops, is they kill grasslands instantly, not over time. So they kill grasslands, they destroy the soil ecosystem, and again also destroy the farm ecosystem. So in industrial crop growing methods, that is, for the last 150 years, ploughing soil has been a major cause of destroyed grasslands and degraded soils. That started in this country at least 150 years ago. If we look at modern crop growing methods, all we've really done is simply replace the plough with a boom spray and pesticides. That has decimated our farm ecosystems, and that is a real problem. And that is happening all over the world. I get to many other countries talking about the type of things I'm talking about today, and our ecosystems, farm and planetary ecosystems, basically are stuffed all over the world. So just a tiny little bit about the crop growing method that I've developed here, called pasture cropping. It was invented and developed in 1993 by myself and Darryl Clough. Darryl Clough is a neighbour of mine, and we were looking at looking at different ways of, or a better way of growing crops that didn't destroy our property. So what pasture cropping is, it's actually a perennial cover cropping technique where your crops are zero-tilled into dormant perennial grassland. And it's the grass itself that is the cover. We hear more and more about cover crops, but this is perennial cover cropping. With pasture cropping, the crop is grown when the grasses are in a natural dormant period. And I won't go into a lot of detail on this, well, I can't in this short talk, but all grasses will go into some form of dormancy. And a lot of the species we have here are summer growing grasses that go dormant in the winter months, which is where we grow our cereal crops, either wheat or oats or barley, those varieties. One thing many things that pasture cropping can do. We can produce good crops for grain and/or grazing, but what it really does, and some of the best things that it does, it will restore grasslands, and it does that by stimulating perennial grass species and species diversity. In other words, by using these techniques overlaid with good grazing management, we can restore grasslands. These methods will also improve soil health and increase soil organic carbon, and that's a combination of having perennial species on the property and planting fast-growing annuals into them. We can also use these methods for improving farm ecosystems as well. Just a tiny little bit here on property and what we're doing with pasture cropping, just a couple of slides. This is a perennial grassland, native grassland. That species is warrior or Paspaldium, mostly in there, but there's a lot of other species in there. There's 50 or 60 species in that grassland. And we harvest seed off those grasslands as well, So that's in the summer. We're zero tilling a crop into that when it goes into dormancy. The crop these photos were taken in the same spot. That's around about this time of the year, about September, October. And then harvest the crop. And by that time, the warm season grasses are starting to emerge from underneath the crop again. Those paddocks have exceptionally good grazing value through the summer again, and then we graze those grasslands again through the summer months. We also harvest native seed off, which I'll show you a little bit about that in a minute. I was looking at ways of improving soil with these crop growing methods and producing high quality grazing values from crops. So I looked at developing multi-species pasture cropping in 2010 and adding to that. So I started growing crops with up to 10 species in them. And things like oats and brassica and vetch and radish, field pea, turnip, all those sown into grassland. Just another photo of these crops. Sorry, I don't know what's happened to my voice. So a mix of 4 to 10 species sown into a grassland does produce superior quality and quantity stock feed. It does, we do get great improvements in soil health, soil structure and carbon. We can add nitrogen with legumes and scavenging to scavenge other nutrients as well, and can get really good weed control, and we can get insect control by adding flowering plants which attract beneficial insects. And we still can harvest a cereal crop after grazing. So it has a lot of benefits. This is a little bit on harvesting native seed. Now, this happens after a multi-species crop, a pasture crop, or a normal pasture crop. So we're harvesting many types of native seed, generally after we harvest the grain off it. Now, a lot of that seed is sold for vegetation. Some of it's used for revegetating mine sites, but a lot of it's used for fellow farmers adding diversity to their properties. But as I said before, and I haven't got time to go into it in a lot of detail, working with the Wimmera Aboriginal people up Narrabri Way in conjunction with Sydney University at rediscovering a lot of the uses of these native grasses. There's some very interesting information and data coming from that work that's been done at Narrabri, which is a research centre that Sydney University own and manage. So just trials and research. The property here, my property, is one of the most researched properties in Australia. So we have a lot of data on the stuff I've just been talking about. So what did I do on Wimmera, on the property here? I changed the grazing management and I changed the way we grow crops. Now here, I did not plant or sow any native species. I managed for them. There was, as this next slide shows, what the results were. When I first started in the early 90s, there was only 10% of the property had native grass on it, so very little native grass on it. And now it has 80% native grass, and the species increased from 9 to 60 native grassland species. Annual weeds like capeweed and Patterson's curse and those types of weeds decreased from 60% to less than 5% over the years. That photo there is just a photo of grassland showing great diversity in it with glycines and all sorts of flowering plants, as well as grasses also. So just to move on Wimmera, on the property here, we haven't used insecticide for over 25 years, but we don't have insect attack in crops or pastures. How is that possible? Because we're told all the time that we need to kill insects. Some work done by Lisa Wendon, Canberra Uni, a fair while ago now, 2007, counting insects. And she found that the insect numbers had increased on this property by 600%, and insect diversity had increased by 125%. But the property no longer gets insect attack in crops or pastures without the use of insecticide. So restoring the grassland has increased insect numbers and species diversity. A lot of that, the increase in insects, or well, not so much insects, but spiders, the increase is with spiders, and many other things like lady beetles. And the bigger photo in there shows native grass seed that we've harvested just 2 years ago, which was covered in lady beetles. I think there was more lady beetles in there than there was seed. But it was really interesting. The diversity in those grasslands now of insects is amazing. So those insects are controlling the crop damaging insects is where I'm getting to. So the restored grassland and tree plantings also have contributed to a significant increase in bird numbers and species diversity. And the property now has 115 bird species on it as well. There's been no fungicide used on the property for over 25 years. And we don't get crop or pasture disease. How's that? with soil microbe tests on Winona have shown increase in fungi and bacteria, protozoa, and nematodes. And if we have a functioning soil ecosystem or a good balance of soil microbes, with great diversity of soil microbes, we don't get crop disease or insect, or fungal disease or in plants. And it's basically about getting our soils functioning. We need to restore our soil ecosystems as well as our farm ecosystems. So there's no fertiliser being used on pasture, no superphosphate, for over 42 years. And crop fertiliser has been reduced by 70%. How's that possible? So again, by restoring a soil ecosystem, we can supply nutrients and minerals to plants. And I won't go into the details there, but basically it's driven by soil microbes again, mycorrhizal fungi, protozoa, nematodes. Will supply and always have supplied nutrients to plants for millions of years. Now, just to put all that together, crop disease, insect attack and decline in soil health are symptoms of the way crops are grown. We need to really have a serious look at the way crops are grown, because we can definitely grow crops without all of those inputs, especially in pesticides. By doing it differently, and some of that's related to cover crops and that as well. We can't keep on throwing pesticides at our crops just to grow grain. So, our soil on the property, and I'm just trying to move through this as quickly as possible. The carbon levels have increased by more than 200%. And this has sequestered about 60 tonne, almost 60 tonne of carbon, which is 213 tonne per hectare of carbon dioxide. In other words, we've removed 213 tonne of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere per hectare over the property. The soils now hold 200% more water. And interestingly, we've done very detailed soil tests here, and all the soil nutrients, including trace elements, have increased by an average of 172%. They haven't decreased, and that's without fertiliser. We still use some fertiliser under the crops, but basically it's without fertiliser. And pH has changed also without the addition of lime. I've got some really detailed data on all of that, which I certainly haven't got time to put in this presentation today. There's been a capital accounting report done here, and which shows the property is sequestering good amounts of carbon. Just to sum this up, is this profitable? Because that's the obvious question that most farmers and landholders want to know. It's okay to have all these things functioning like they are, but is it profitable? That $80,000 that I mentioned early in my talk, now we don't spend at all. The $80,000 that my father was spending with fertiliser and pesticides and that, we save, and that's every year. There's so $80,000 ahead before we even start. So compared to previous high input agriculture that was practiced on the property, our annual income is higher. We run more livestock, we have good crop yields, and wool quality is better. We harvest and sell over a tonne. We harvest about 2 tonne now of native grass seed. Soil organic carbon levels are increasing, and phosphorus, calcium, all the trace elements are increasing with $80,000 less inputs and less labour. I didn't put any labour savings in there because no one would have believed how much money we're actually saving if you put labour into it. So, to sum all this up, our farms should function as ecosystems. If they function as ecosystems, Mother Nature will drive it for us. The last slide. agriculture can be more profitable and regenerate our farms and our farm ecosystems, and we can start to restore the problems on this planet, fix the problems on this planet. But agricultural practices need to function closer to how nature had originally designed. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. That was a really great presentation, and it really reinforces how farm diversity can be implemented, and it takes a bit of time and a bit of practice and a bit of knowledge, but it's not impossible to achieve. We've got a few questions. First one from Fiona is, how do you manage the timing of the grazing and harvesting to protect the natives, especially the ones palatable to sheep, specifically Murnong?
Yeah. Okay. It's a bit like managing a crop, really, or growing a crop. It's growing naturally. So what we do here is, when we're grazing, if these areas that we want to harvest, we just simply skip those paddocks and don't graze them. There's far more profitable to do that than to graze it. I'm not working with Murnong on here. I'd say Tim and people like Bruce Pascoe would know more about Murnong than I certainly would. I'm working specifically on native grasslands, grasses really, not forbs and herbs. But it's not that difficult to manage it in regard to grazing, but you do tend to manage it a little bit like a crop, and just keep the sheep off it and let it seed, and then harvest.
Thanks, Colin. A few more questions coming through. I don't know what this is, but you will. What C4 species have you got?
Okay. I won't mention the 60 of them, but there's many of them. Red grass is one, and some bluegrass, or red grass is Bothocloea, Dicanthia. We've got some warrego, which is a very high quality grass. Like one of the fattest I had was warrego or Paspalinium. There's another very good species, green summergrass, which is a Bracharia. We have cotton panic, which is one of the Digitarias. They're all C4s. Those, or there'd be probably 30 species of C4s here, I guess.
The diversity is amazing that you're speaking of, Colin. It's mind blowing to think that you've got that much diversity on your farm. It's really inspiring.
That's right. I should have said what C4s are. C4s are summer grasses, the grasses that grow through those warm, hot summer months. So that's really what C4 grasses are.
Well, that leads me to my quick question is, how much rainfall do you have? Because I saw that photo of a paddock in February, and my little 20 acres south of Horsham doesn't look like that, I'll tell you now.
Yeah. Probably about the same as you get, about 600 mil. It is a bit more evenly distributed than in Victoria. But the main reason that we have farms that don't have green grasses through the summer is that we've simply lost them. If we look at the grasslands in Australia and how they were, and look at some of the early explorers' reports and read someone like Bill Gamage's book on the biggest estate on earth, you will notice, you'll see that there were grasslands right through and into Victoria. And some reports from the early explorers in Victoria described grass like a wheat field, and some of the early settlers had problems finding cattle in their grasslands. Okay, the cattle probably weren't as big those days, but still they were magnificent grasslands. That was in January. and that's well documented. You can find that information. So, in other words, the grasslands have been lost from Victoria, and I guess this is why I talk about grasslands in detail, in more detail than I did today.
So leading on from that, another question is, have you tried any fire regimes on your property for managing the grasslands?
I did, experimentally, and idiot here, as in me, didn't ask the experts, of course, and I did this about 25 years ago, who are the Aboriginal people, about how to manage properties with fire. And I did a lot of damage. I burnt an area of Themis or kangaroo grass and did a lot of damage to it because I burnt it at the wrong time of the year. Now, what we need to do, if we wanting to learn how to manage with fire, with burning, is ask the experts. And someone like me, a white fella, has no idea how we should burn. Our Aboriginal people have been burning for thousands of years. They know how to do it. We certainly don't, and I proved that I didn't know how to burn, and I haven't done it since. I certainly would like to learn more about managing with fire, but I thought I'd better leave that alone, leave it to the experts to work that one out.
Thanks, Colin. There's a few more questions coming through. With the native grasses that you have now, were the paddocks previously cropped and denuded of any native pasture, or did they always have a little bit left over?
No, this property has been cropped since about the 1880s or 1890s. I've been seriously cropped. And my father grew a lot of wheat on it from the 1930s and 40s and 50s. So some of it had no grass on it at all, no native grass on it at all. And how I got the grasses back is not by sowing them, but by managing for them. And the way I approached that, if there was one grass species in a paddock that I found, and sometimes that was the case, I'd manage the whole paddock as though it was covered in that grass. In other words, you just look after that grass species. So how did the grassland return? And the answer is that there was a lot of seed in the soil, and it could have been there for 50 years or even longer. And once I created the conditions for those seeds that were sitting in the soil to germinate, they germinated. They didn't want it to germinate. They weren't going to germinate with the high input, high pesticide regime that we had before. But when I changed it, then they germinated. And a lot of that's to do with pasture cropping and root exudation of sugars, feeding soil microbes and creating a healthy soil ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you, Colin. It always comes back to that ecosystem and diversity. It's really important. Another question is around the managing the issue of weeds without the use of herbicides, and probably part of my question of that is, how long did it take from the day that you said this isn't working, we've got to do something different, to achieving what you set out to do to be a holistic farm?
Yeah. Before I go down that track, I'm not an organic farmer, and I do use sometimes very selective herbicides. But in saying that, the property here was covered in capeweed and Patterson's curse. It was a combination of purple and yellow. So, those species are not that difficult to get rid of. What we do, to do that, we need to fix the problem, or fix the reason why they're growing, and usually that's bare soil. Capeweed in particular likes bare soil and high nitrate levels. That's why you often see it around old sheep camps and things like that. But if our properties are going into autumn, out of summer and into autumn, with no ground cover, that's exactly what you'll get. You'll get capeweed, Patterson skirts, saffron thistles, all those things that germinate in the autumn. So the key to that is to have more ground cover through the summer and into the autumn. So, and that's really what we started to do here. I concentrated, even in the 1980s, I was concentrating on litter and ground cover, and that is the key to less weeds. And we know that. We've only got to watch Costa's gardening show on Sunday, and he'll tell you that. We know how to garden very well, and it should be compulsory for all farmers to watch Costa's gardening show, because they will learn more about farming than probably anything else. We know by putting mulch or litter on our soil surface, a few things will happen. We'll stop weeds from growing. We don't have to water it so often, and the soil is cooler and healthier. So why don't we do that in our paddocks? And that's what gets rid of weeds.
That'll help. The crossover between Costa being a wonderful friend of the Wimmera Biodiversity Seminar and what he talks about every week on a gardening show is applicable in a much broader scale farming scenario.
Yep. Yeah.
Another question is, do you have to import any stock feed to cover any low points in production or drought years and things like that, where you might have between the high crop and high grass production periods, or do you cut your own hay to feed out during those crossover periods? And I'm thinking a bit about your 75 paddocks, intrigues me as well. So.
We haven't cut hay here for about 40 years. We certainly don't need it. However, we do store oats on farm for dry seasons, but we rarely ever have to use it. The 3 years of very serious drought 3 years ago, we did feed, but most years no, we don't need to feed, and rarely. Well, I used to say before one of those years that 2019, that we never ever drought fed, but that year we did, but it's really quite rare. If we get it all functioning well, and we get if we look, remember, it's vital to have perennial plants. We don't necessarily need native plants, but we need perennial plants, and our properties and our combination of plants should function like grasslands. In other words, we should have cool season grasses growing in the winter, warm season grasses growing in the summer, both complementing each other. So then we have no feed gaps at all. That's how grasslands function. And we can do it on our properties, and then they're very resilient. And then we start restoring farm ecosystems, and then things start falling into place. So yeah, we shouldn't need to be having to feed animals. For example, if we're needing every year we're feeding animals, the property obviously isn't capable of running those animals. So something has to change. And mostly it's a feed deficit at a particular time of the year.
Which comes back to that holistically looking at everything that you're doing on your farm. Too many animals, not enough feed. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And probably the last question for the session is, have you measured any changes in salinity from before you introduced the holistic management practices and grasslands to now?
Yeah. Okay. One of the interesting things here was the property had, well, and probably still has, I guess, some serious dryland salinity areas on it. And the property here in the 1980s and 90s was one of the major dryland salinity experimental farms in New South Wales. And I got interested in a lot of this, the grassland stuff. We're trying to resolve the salinity issues of fixing the recharge areas, or where the water's getting into the system. So just without going on too far down that track, yeah, most of those saline areas have now healed and they're productive. And they were on the property again because of previous management of destroying the farm's whole hydrology with the destruction of the grasslands. So yes, most of those areas have now healed, and so we can restore and fix most of our problems on our properties with all at the same time, really. And this is all about, I shouldn't rabbit on too much about it, but restoring grasslands, or at least the function of grasslands.
Thanks, Colin. It's been a really informative presentation, and thank you for fielding lots of questions at the end there. If we've got any other questions come through, we can certainly follow up and share that information. Annie's also shared in the chat a website that has more information, Pasture Cropping on Winona, a Soils for Life case study. So if anyone would like to have a look at more information on Colin's property, it's available there. So I'd like to thank Colin and Tim. Sorry.
Okay,
Go.
sorry.
No, you're right.
If there's any other questions come through, I'll be pleased to answer them, either email them, answers and stuff. That's all fine if someone's got additional questions.
Wonderful. Thanks, Colin. That's great. So thank you everyone for participating today in our 4th of 5 Wimmera Biodiversity seminar sessions for the year. And if there's a link in the chat from Annie for the survey, if it only takes a minute or so to complete, and you just let us know how we went today and whether you've got any ideas for future forums. All things going well, we'll be in person next year, and we might have a blend of both, realising that a lot of our participants are from all over the countryside and can't always get to the Wimmera. So yeah, we'll look at a blended way to deliver the seminar into the future. So thanks everyone for joining in, and enjoy the rest of your day.